The end of World War II marked a turning point for Britain's airfields. The sudden cessation of hostilities left the nation with a massive surplus of military infrastructure, built during the most intense years of warfare. Airfields that had once been bustling hubs of activity, teeming with aircraft, crews, and the relentless sounds of combat, were now abandoned or repurposed, often left to decay in a world where war was no longer the focus. What remained was a complex web of decisions, financial pressures, and logistical challenges that would shape the fate of these once vital sites. By 1945, Britain had constructed over 1,000 airfields in response to the escalating demands of the war. These airstrips, runways, and associated facilities ranged from small emergency landing sites to large, fully equipped stations capable of hosting entire squadrons. With the war over, the sudden need for this extensive network of airfields evaporated almost overnight. Many had been hastily constructed in the early years of the conflict, designed with speed and necessity in mind, rather than long-term sustainability. Once the immediate threat of Nazi Germany had passed, these airfields no longer served their wartime purpose. The immediate challenge facing the British government and military was not only how to handle the airfields but also what to do with the surplus infrastructure that was now scattered across the country. A large portion of the airfields were located in remote rural areas or on farmland that had been requisitioned for wartime use. The rapid decline in military activity forced the government to consider what to do with these sites, which were now costing money to maintain but providing little in return. The sheer scale of the situation was daunting. In addition to the airfields themselves, vast quantities of materials and equipment had to be accounted for. Over 25,000 aircraft had been produced by the British during the war, and many of the engines, fuel tanks, spare parts, and other components associated with the airfields became surplus to requirements. The airfields, once vibrant with the hum of wartime production, were now sites of excess that demanded resolution. One of the first responses came in the form of cuts to military budgets. The immediate post-war years saw Britain's finances in dire straits. The economy, already strained by the costs of the war, was unable to support a military force of the scale that had existed during the conflict. As a result, many airfields were closed, abandoned, or handed over to civilian authorities, who often had little use for the sites in their new peacetime role. Some of the airfields, however, were repurposed for civilian aviation. The most prominent example of this transition was Heathrow, which had been an RAF base during the war and quickly became Britain's busiest civilian airport in the post-war years. For many others, however, the transition was less glamorous. Smaller airfields were either dismantled or left to rot. The process was slow, and many of the sites fell into disrepair, their runways cracked and overgrown with weeds, hangars rusting, and control towers empty. Meanwhile, the strategic airfields, those used for defensive purposes during the war, faced their own set of challenges. Many of these sites had been built with the latest technology of the era: radar installations, sophisticated communications networks, and large storage facilities for fuel and munitions. Yet, with the conclusion of the war and the change in national priorities, much of this infrastructure was seen as surplus. Some sites were cleared, with materials salvaged for reuse, while others were simply abandoned. An estimated 500 airfields were rendered redundant or transferred to civilian use by 1947. However, these actions only scratched the surface of the problem. Many smaller or less strategically located airfields were either mothballed or left in limbo, their fate uncertain. Military personnel were slowly withdrawn from the sites, and civilian contractors were hired to dismantle the facilities. Still, the pace of these efforts was slow. In some cases, entire communities were left to grapple with the remnants of wartime construction that seemed disconnected from the peacetime world they now inhabited. The economic reality of the post-war period exacerbated the situation. Britain's recovery from the war was complicated by severe shortages of both resources and manpower. Labor unions, focused on rebuilding the civilian economy, were less inclined to provide the necessary workforce to dismantle the airfields. Additionally, the government faced a critical shortage of funds, and repurposing or scrapping airfields was often pushed to the bottom of the national agenda. Many sites remained unused for years, with nothing more than a skeletal crew of maintenance workers tasked with keeping them secure. In 1948, a decision was made to begin the process of consolidating airfield resources. Sites that were deemed unnecessary were earmarked for closure, while others were sold off to private owners. Yet, even with this strategic move, the question of what to do with the vast, open spaces of these airfields remained unresolved. Some were left to gradually deteriorate, their concrete and tarmac foundations breaking down under the weight of time. Others were sold for scrap, their valuable materials dismantled and melted down to support the rebuilding of Britain's shattered infrastructure. As the 1950s dawned, the landscape of Britain's airfields had changed dramatically. What was once an expansive network of military infrastructure was now a collection of dilapidated remnants, some transformed into agricultural land, others abandoned and forgotten. But it was not only the land itself that had been affected by the war's aftermath. The people who had lived and worked on these airfields during the conflict also had to adjust to the new reality. With many airfields closed or repurposed, former workers found themselves out of work or relocated to different sectors. In some areas, local economies had grown dependent on the presence of the airfields, and the loss of jobs at these sites added another layer of hardship to the post-war recovery process. Communities surrounding airfields in rural parts of Britain were left in uncertainty, unsure of how to adapt to the changing times. The transition from wartime to peacetime was not an easy one, and the fate of Britain's airfields reflected the broader struggles the nation faced. The shifting priorities, economic pressures, and the sheer magnitude of the task made it clear that the airfields could not simply be abandoned, nor could they be preserved in their wartime state. Their destiny was to be determined by a mixture of political, economic, and social forces that were still evolving as the first few years of peace passed. At this point, the full resolution of the airfield's fate had not yet become clear. Some sites had been sold and repurposed, while others remained in a state of suspended animation. There were plans to dismantle or redevelop many of the remaining airfields, but the logistics and costs of such operations were formidable. For now, the fate of Britain's wartime airfields remained a patchwork of ad hoc decisions and long-term uncertainties, with no definitive end in sight. With the passage of time, the remnants of Britain's wartime airfields slowly began to fade into history. By the early 1950s, many of the country's once bustling military airstrips had been cleared away, their infrastructure sold off or left to rot. However, the story of what happened to these sites did not end with their abandonment. The process of reimagining and repurposing these fields extended into the following decades, revealing a complicated, ongoing transformation influenced by shifting political, economic, and social pressures. In the aftermath of the war, the pace of dismantling airfields accelerated, driven by necessity. The post-war British economy was struggling under the weight of war debt, rationing, and rebuilding efforts. With limited resources and manpower, the government found it difficult to maintain airfields that were no longer needed for military operations. By 1950, the Ministry of Defense had begun a large-scale program of closure, focusing on sites deemed redundant or unnecessary. In total, hundreds of airfields across Britain were either closed, sold, or repurposed for other uses. Yet, this mass closure was not a smooth process, and the fate of many sites remained uncertain for years. The first step in dealing with the vast number of surplus airfields was to clear the land. Many of the smaller and less strategically important airfields were simply abandoned, left to nature's slow reclamation. Grass and weeds grew over the tarmac runways, while the hangars and control towers were left to rust. Without sufficient resources for maintenance, much of the wartime infrastructure began to crumble. For instance, at some sites, the once vibrant airfields became little more than ghostly relics, marked only by the occasional forgotten building or deteriorating airstrip. Despite this neglect, not all the sites met a similar fate. A number of airfields found new life in civilian hands, particularly those located near major cities or key transportation routes. With the rise of commercial aviation in the post-war period, the demand for new airports grew. The most notable of these was London Heathrow, which, originally a Royal Air Force station, transformed into the country's busiest civilian airport by 1955. Other sites were similarly adapted for civilian use, albeit on a smaller scale. As Britain's commercial air travel industry took off, several smaller airfields were converted into civilian airports, though most of them were too small to compete with the likes of Heathrow. Airfields like Manchester and Gatwick also expanded their role in accommodating civilian air traffic, though the repurposing of the airfields wasn't always seamless or immediate. However, the shift towards civilian aviation was only part of the story. Another wave of repurposing came with the development of military technology during the Cold War. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw Britain transitioning into the early stages of the nuclear age. This shift led to the need for a different type of airbase, those equipped to handle the demands of long-range bombers, missile systems, and radar installations. Several former wartime airfields were reactivated for these purposes, and some were modified to accommodate the new strategic needs of Britain's armed forces. For example, RAF bases in the east of England were repurposed for the Cold War era, with modifications made to their runways and hangars to handle newer, heavier aircraft and weapons systems. While many of the wartime airfields were closed or dismantled, a select number found themselves at the forefront of Britain's Cold War defense strategy. The 1950s and 1960s also saw the emergence of a new aviation-related industry, the burgeoning field of commercial aircraft manufacturing. In particular, Britain's aerospace sector, led by companies like de Havilland and Hawker Siddeley, began to thrive. As part of this development, certain airfields were repurposed as manufacturing sites or research facilities. For example, the former RAF airfield at Hatfield became the headquarters of de Havilland, where the company developed the famous Comet jet airliner. The repurposing of military airfields for aerospace industry purposes was an economic lifeline for some regions, providing jobs and investment at a time when unemployment was high in certain areas. Yet, not all post-war transformations were as successful. Many airfields, particularly those located in remote parts of the country, were left abandoned for decades. In the 1960s, a major government initiative began to explore the possibility of turning some of these sites into agricultural land. The airfields were often located on fertile farmland that had been requisitioned during the war. As Britain struggled to feed itself in the post-war years, the idea of converting these vast, open spaces into working farms gained traction. This was particularly true for those airfields located in rural or isolated areas, where the potential for agricultural use was higher. In some cases, entire runways were plowed over, and the hangars were demolished to make room for new crops. However, the process was slow, and much of the land sat idle for years before being fully repurposed. In other instances, airfields were transformed into industrial zones. The surplus buildings, particularly the large hangars, were repurposed for manufacturing purposes. Some airfields, like the one at Culloden in Wiltshire, became hubs for small-scale manufacturing, while others were used for storage or distribution. The abundance of open space, combined with the existing infrastructure, made the airfields an attractive proposition for businesses looking to expand. This was particularly true during the economic boom of the 1960s, when Britain's economy began to recover from the hardships of the immediate post-war period. Yet, many of these conversions were only temporary, with the rise of more modern industrial parks and business complexes pushing the former airfields further into the periphery of Britain's economy. As the 1970s arrived, the transformation of Britain's wartime airfields had largely come to an end. Many of the sites had either been repurposed for civilian or industrial use, or they had been left abandoned, slowly sinking into obscurity. Some were turned into public spaces or nature reserves, their runways now home to birds and wildlife rather than aircraft. Others became part of the country's historical heritage, with small museums and memorials set up to preserve their legacy. Yet, even these were few in number, and the majority of wartime airfields slipped from public consciousness. The final blow to many of these sites came with the increasing privatization and commercialization of land during the 1980s and 1990s. As the British government pursued policies of deregulation and privatization, the fate of many wartime airfields was sealed. Some were sold to developers, who demolished what remained of the buildings and built new residential areas or business parks. Others were simply abandoned, their once vital infrastructure now nothing more than a memory. Today, only a few of Britain's wartime airfields remain intact. Some have been preserved as part of heritage initiatives, with the public able to visit sites like RAF Duxford, now home to the Imperial War Museum. Others, like RAF Scampton, once home to the famous Dambusters, are preserved as military bases but are no longer actively used for aviation purposes. The majority of the airfields, however, have been lost to time, their concrete runways and hangars slowly vanishing under the weight of history and development. The fate of Britain's wartime airfields serves as a poignant reminder of the immense scale of wartime mobilization and the equally profound consequences of peace. For a brief moment, these sites were central to the nation's survival and victory. Yet, in the aftermath of the war, they became symbols of obsolescence and the difficult process of transition. What had once been vital parts of Britain's military and industrial infrastructure were ultimately cast aside as the country moved into a new era, an era where the threats and demands of wartime were no longer as pressing. And in this transformation, many of the airfields were lost to history, abandoned, or repurposed, their legacy fading into the past. The story of these airfields is a silent testament to the fleeting nature of conflict and the complex challenges of rebuilding after war.